The mysterious cry for help. In 1989, two hikers got lost while climbing Mount Asahideck in Susan National Park. Luckily, they were found when a helicopter spotted a large SOS sign made from stacked birch trees, which they hadn't created themselves. The police were puzzled as to who made the SOS sign if the hikers didn't do it. They searched the area and found human bones with bite marks and fractures, suggesting a tragic event had occurred before the person died. During the search, they discovered a hole containing a human skull, personal items, and cassette tapes. One of the tapes had a man's desperate voice calling for help from a cliff, but it was incoherent and challenging to understand. The police believed the bones belonged to a 25-year-old male office worker named Kenji Iwamura, but the testing revealed they belonged to a female between 30 years old. This discrepancy confused the investigators even more. The other tapes found were filled with music from anime TV shows, which added to the mystery. They also found a cutout of magical Princess Minky Momo artwork used as a cassette tape case. The SOS sign had been made by stacking large fallen birch trees, a task that would have taken 2 days and required significant effort. However, the skeleton found was of a thin and weak person, making it impossible for them to have made the sign alone. There were no clues about a missing woman connected to Kenji Iwamura or any record of such a person disappearing. The whole situation remained puzzling and unexplained. The unsolved mystery of Jean Spangler. Jean Spangler left her home in Los Angeles on October 7, 1949, to go on a night shoot. Jean, a 26-year-old aspiring actress, hoped to make it big. She had taken a well-worn path as a dancer and model. She had married, had children, and had divorced. She and her daughter, Christine, were living with her mother at the time. Her mother was out of town at the time, so she asked her sister to look after Christine. Jean explained that she was going to see her ex-husband first for alimony issues, then to the studio for some late-night shooting. She'd be late getting home. She walked out the door, never to be seen again. The police were told the next day and started their investigations. They soon discovered that everything John had told her family had been a lie. There had been no appointment to see her ex-husband, and the studios had no record of her on a night shoot. There were no leads until Jean's purse was discovered 2 days later. Because the strap had been ripped and there was no cash inside, the police suspected robbery. However, Jean's sister informed them that she had left home without money, despite the fact that a struggle appeared to have occurred. However, there was a hint inside. A note. "I can't wait any longer. I'm off to see Dr. Scott. It will be most effective this way while Mother is away." It was addressed to Kirk. Who could this enigmatic Kirk be? Let me take a look. She had recently completed work on the film Young Man with a Horn. Who is the star? Kirk Douglas is an actor. When this information became public, Kirk Douglas immediately contacted the police to deny any involvement. He did this before the police contacted him. He had never met the girl. Not in the least. They'd never met before. They've never spoken to each other. Someone then pointed out to him that he did, in fact, know her and that they had spoken. "Yes," he replied. "I recall now. They just flirted," he explained, nervously looking around to see if anyone else had anything to say. They didn't do it. So Kirk was no longer in the picture. Who would have thought that a top actor like Kirk Douglas would behave violently toward a young girl? The news spread quickly throughout the country and was watched by millions. Nothing else was ever discovered. Luella Parsons, a newspaper columnist and one of America's most famous and influential women, offered a prize. Nothing. No body was ever discovered. The story had vanished. Christine was raised without a mother. Her father won custody and refused to allow her grandmother visitation rights in violation of a court order. He fled with his daughter, eventually settling in Florida, where he died in 2007. The world moved on, and Jean Spangler's name was forgotten. The case is still open in Los Angeles. Unsolved case of Sodder children. This is my favorite spooky mystery that keeps me shivering in fear in my bed at night. In 1945, on Christmas Eve, the Sodder home was destroyed by a fire. The husband, George, and his wife, Jenny, escaped along with 4 of their 9 children. The 5 missing children were never found, and the Sodder family believe they are still alive. When midnight came along, Jenny was woken by a phone call from a lady asking for an unfamiliar individual, followed by clinking glasses and a weird laugh. Jenny told her she had the wrong number and went back to bed. She noticed the lights were still on and the curtains were not drawn, which her children normally would do. Jenny turned off the light and closed the curtain, thinking the children were sleeping in the attic. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Jenny heard something hit the roof and roll. She went back to sleep and later found her husband's office on fire. She and her husband called their children down, and 4 of them escaped. The stairway to the attic was blocked by the fire, so the family couldn't rescue the other 5 children. For some reason, their phone didn't work, so they used a neighbor's phone. A driver also saw the fire and called unsuccessfully. None of them reached the operator because the phone there was broken. Firefighters were reached from another phone in town and came to the rescue. During this time, George Sodder and his sons tried to use a ladder to rescue their children, which they could not find. They also tried to use a water barrel to extinguish the fire, and it was frozen. He then tried to use his trucks to climb up to the attic window, but both of them would not start. Later, the firefighters extinguished the blaze and found no evidence of human remains. Sodder later covered the remains of the house in dirt as a memorial. Apparently, George had made a few rude remarks about Mussolini, and an angry stranger went up to him, pointed at 2 fuse boxes outside his house, and promised him that they would cause his house to burn down. Shortly after that, another man trying to sell the Sodder family insurance became angry and also claimed the Sodder house would burn. Older Sodder sons later recalled a weird man parked on the highway watching the kids come home from school a few days before the fire. A witness claims to have seen a man at the fire scene taking a block and tackle, which was used for removing car engines. Later on, a rubber object was found in the yard. It was a napalm pineapple bomb, the object that hit their roof. Over the years, many people have claimed to have seen the Sodder children, and at one point, George Sodder saw a picture of a girl that looked like his daughter in the newspaper, tried to visit her, and was denied. 20 years after the fire, a man that resembled one of the Sodder children wrote a letter to the Sodder family, saying he was Louis Sodder and loved his siblings. The family immediately recognized him, but there wasn't a return address. A private investigator was hired, but he never returned to the Sodder family. Many members of the Sodder family have died, without ever knowing what really happened to their children. Hinterkaifeck murders. Every year, hundreds upon hundreds of murders go cold. No one ever arrested and bodies never identified. Naturally, this means there are a multitude of disturbing stories with no answers I could tell you. But I'm going to give you one of the very strangest, the infamous Hinterkaifeck murders. This lonely farmstead was home to a 35-year-old woman named Victoria Gabriel, 2 young children named Kazelia and Josef, and their elderly grandparents, Kazelia and Andreas Gruber. The warning signs that something would go horribly wrong were apparent for several days before the murders took place. Andreas noticed a pristine trail of footprints a few days before the murder. The footprints led onto the farmstead, but the prints only went in one direction. Someone had entered and had never come back out. Even more curiously, Andreas noticed a pair of his keys go missing. A newspaper he never bought appeared in his house, and whispers and footsteps could be heard from the attic. A few days later, on April 1st, 1922, neighbors first started to feel concern. The family was known for being reclusive, but Kazelia missing school and the entire family failing to come to church unsettled many. When Kazelia missed another day of school on April 3rd, and mail started to pile up at the local post office, neighbors decided to take matters into their own hands and broke into the house a day later. What they saw would go on to haunt them for the rest of their days. In the barn, 4 mangled bodies lay strewn across the floor, half covered with hay in an attempt to hide the gruesome display. The elder Kazelia's skull was cracked, purple bruises wrapped around her neck. Andreas's face was caked in dried blood, his cheeks slashed with bone poking out, Victoria's skull was smashed and poor little Cazilia's jaw was shattered with horrific wounds scattered across her face and neck. Inside the house, Joseph and the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, met a similarly grisly end. Both of them were killed with heavy blows to the head, and both of their bodies were covered up, just like the ones in the barn. A few days had passed between the murders and the discovery of the bodies, and over this period of time, the killer tended the farm and took care of all the animals, even going to the trouble of milking the cows. He kept the fireplace lit so smoke would come from the chimney, making it seem as though the house was still inhabited. This is why the bodies went undiscovered for so long. Once the bodies were discovered and reported to the police, autopsies were performed. Mercifully, almost all the victims died instantly with the exception of young Cazilia. The autopsy found evidence that she remained alive for several hours after the fatal blow was dealt, frozen in shock and horror. Clumps of hair in her hands and bald patches on her head were found as well, suggesting the extent of her terror was so great she tore her own hair out. So who committed such a cruel and depraved act? Police considered the possibility of thieves, but quickly dropped it when large amounts of money were found undisturbed in the house. The motive behind this went deeper than just money. Investigations led police to a woman who worked as a maid for the Gruber family up until 6 months before the murders. When asked why she quit the job, the former maid replied that she believed the house was haunted. She heard strange noises in the house, such as footsteps and whispering. Eventually, she quit her job in fear, leaving the Grubers to believe the poor woman was mentally disturbed. The former maid's story carried the horrifying implication that the Grubers' killer had hidden in the house for months before the attack, likely seeking refuge in the attic. Because of this, and the way the killer took care of the farm in the days following the Grubers' murder, police concluded that the killer was someone very familiar with the family and their farmstead. Thus, police zeroed in on a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz is suspected to be the father of Victoria's child Joseph, and they originally planned to marry before Andreas interrupted the relationship. He married someone else shortly after, and though they had a baby together, it died just a few weeks later. Theories state Lorenz was deeply in shock from the death of his child, and in a fit of jealousy, he murdered the Grubers. Why would he be jealous, you ask? Lorenz was never proven to be Joseph's father. His parentage is still a mystery to this day. But aside from the theory that Lorenz fathered Joseph, there was another popular claim. Andreas and his daughter Victoria had a known incestuous relationship that had been documented in court. And so, some believe that Joseph is the child of Victoria and Andreas. Perhaps Lorenz was angry that Victoria had a child with another man, her own father no less. However, even though the police questioned him extensively, they couldn't find any evidence that he was behind the Hinterkaifeck murders. Briefly, police wondered whether or not a murder-suicide took place, perpetrated by Victoria or Andreas out of shame for Joseph's existence. However, autopsies confirmed that none of the wounds on any of the victims were self-inflicted. Another short-lived theory was that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, committed the murders. He'd gone missing 8 years previously, and police thought he might have returned to commit the murders. Later, it was found out that he was almost certainly dead. He was shot down in World War I, with several comrades reporting seeing his dead body. Though his body was never recovered, overwhelming evidence suggested he had been dead for years, and police didn't investigate further. And so, police searched aimlessly for the killer, interrogating over 100 people about the crime, with the most recent interrogation taking place in 1986. Though police had their suspicions about several people, there was never enough evidence to convict someone. They were desperate enough to remove the skulls of the victims and send them to psychics who claimed they could detect metaphysical evidence from them. The skulls were lost in the chaos of World War II and were never recovered. In 1923, the farm was destroyed and a memorial erected in its place. The family was buried there, still missing their heads. The case was opened up many times over the years to no avail. A woman contacted police in 1999, claiming to have information about the case. Since the person mentioned as a suspect was dead, no arrests were made. In 2007, several students examined the remnants of the crime scene, confirming what everyone already knew. There was no longer any trace of evidence, and there was no way to conclusively solve the case. They did come up with a theory, but out of respect for the suspected killer's living family members, this theory has never been made public. For all intents and purposes, this case is as cold and lifeless as the Grubers themselves, with no way to gather fresh evidence and no one alive who knows anything new about the case. The murders will likely remain a mystery forever. Even though it happened almost a century ago, the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to baffle, and we'll never know exactly what happened the night of March 31st, 1922. The disappearance of Michael Dunahee. Michael Dunahee is a missing person who disappeared on Sunday, March 24, 1991, from Blanchard Elementary School in Victoria, BC, Canada. He was 4 years old and 10 months, and was walking across the parking lot to the playground, where he was to meet his dad minutes later. Him and his parents and baby sister were there for his mum, Crystal's football game, and despite the area being busy with families at the time, no one saw anything. Michael disappeared within minutes, and it's still unclear if he made it to the playground or not. I am on the 3rd episode of the Missing Michael podcast, and I'm curious as to why the police no longer find the brown van possible Michael Dunahee sighting in the alley credible. It was a 10-year-old girl who said that she saw Michael get into a brown van that had a large plastic bag and a bulldog in it. They didn't explain why this tip is no longer relevant or credible. Does anyone know why? I'm thinking it was due to her age, and perhaps her story changed. Also, Michael's grandmother was on the podcast and said she worked for BC Ferries at the time, and when she returned to work after he went missing, a co-worker told her someone had seen an inconsolable crying child on the 3 p.m. sailing. I'm actually quite shocked that the 3 p.m. sailing left as planned, since Michael was reported missing around 1 p.m. I thought maybe they would have stopped every vehicle to search before getting on the ferry. Mind you, maybe they were still thinking he had only wandered off at this point.